And we'll just give everybody a second to come in.
Welcome in, guys.
Cool. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Whoever missed this intro can come back and watch it. But we are here with Chrissy Jackson, who is the author of the Reparations Handbook, which comes out on the 17th. It's a really great book. We got the opportunity to read it early and sit down and have this little discussion with her, which is awesome. Thank you so much, Chrissy, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And you can just tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, about the book.
Okay, so I guess to start out, I got my intro into authorship, if you will, during my time at the University of Missouri, Columbia, Mizzou. I worked for the Minority Report for the NAACP. And from there, I found in 2014, after the murder of Michael Brown Jr., I co-founded an organization called the Truth Telling Project. At my time during the Truth Telling Project, I was introduced to now Senator Cori Bush. But back then, I got an opportunity to work on her early campaigns as a social media manager, which really, sparked my interest in social justice in the realm of politics at the time. And so after my time with Cori, I went on to lead campaigns, membership building and fundraising campaigns for organizations like Planned Parenthood and the Southern Poverty Law Center and ACLU. And and then, kind of simultaneously, I was also studying and getting my start into financial advising, into credit repair, and currently I work as a financial advisor and credit specialist, helping to empower everyone, but specifically, my passion is empowering the Black community into being able to take control of their finances and to use it as a tool to build wealth. Additionally, as part of the Truth Telling Project, I got an opportunity to work with an organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation on a grassroots reparations campaign. And that was really my start in inspiring what has become this book. And so this book is essentially, it was intended to be used as a resource, an educational tool that fellow advocates and activists and community leaders and politicians that we can all use in order to reference why there should be reparations for Black Americans and direct steps that we can use or that we can take to get there. So, overall, the book is describing the commitment that the United States made to human rights. We describe the commitment that the United States made to provide remedy and reparations whenever human rights are violated by the United States. We lay out the case for reparations as in, these are the following ways that the human rights of African Americans have been violated and continue to be violated throughout history and currently in the United States. And these are direct steps to take in order to provide remedy and reparation for these violations. So that's what to expect in the book.
Yeah, and you laid all that out very well. I think it was a very strong argument that you gave for giving reparations, and I want to start at the beginning of the book. You kind of talked about this this bill HR 40. So I was wondering if you could kind of touch on that during this and flesh it out. And it's not passed, and it hasn't been passed, but maybe what would it look like if it was passed? Maybe we can look forward to.
Yeah, so essentially, HR 40 is a bill that would create a research committee in Congress, and they would investigate the role that both federal and state governments have had in slavery and the ongoing effects that slavery and discrimination has had on not only Black communities but the nation as a whole. And then from there, create ideas on how to provide remedy and repair for the harm that has been caused. So it would be up to the committee to decide, what that would look like. But I would imagine that the committee would be divided into subcommittees tasked with researching topics that we talk about in the book, such as the nation's foundation of wealth and slavery's role in building that wealth and creating, our foundation. And then also, genocide and the legacy of convict leasing and how that kind of grew into our current criminal justice system. And and then, from there, ideas would be discussed on how we can provide remedy and reparation.
So if HR 40 is just to set up a task force to do research on these things, do you have an opinion on why we haven't been able to move forward with something like that?
Yeah, I think that when and if this bill does pass, it will become evident in the research that this bill has not passed for so long, and there's been so much opposition to the bill because of the legacy that white supremacy has had in the country due to the lack of reparation given immediately after slavery. And so, essentially there were several times in our past where Congress could have taken kind of like taken the bull by the rings, I guess that's the saying, and really like made a precedent in the United States for all citizens to kind of interpret the Constitution in a context of equality for all citizens. But so many times immediately after slavery, when Congress had that opportunity, instead they took the opportunity to uphold systems of racial hierarchy and white supremacy. And because of that, even today, we are still experiencing that legacy of white supremacy in almost every facet of American life. And I think that that is a major reason why there has been so much opposition to even getting this bill passed in the first place. I mean, we're literally just talking about having a research study here. What's the issue? The issue is racism. That's what it is.
And you've touched on a couple of these points, but I think you did a really good job and kind of laying out this history and trauma. Like any step of the way, the government could have stepped in and given reparations, but they didn't. It kind of allowed this to spiral out of control and become this huge systemic problem that we face today. But I was wondering, how important do you think it is in like teaching these in our high schools, teaching this history? And we learned some of this, but there's a lot in your book that I never knew about before reading the book because it just wasn't taught. It was kind of covered up. So how important do you think that education is into getting this bill passed and the conversation about reparations?
Yeah, so, I do want to clarify that the trauma is in regards to just providing evidence for the case of reparations and the times that that the United States violated their commitment to protecting the human rights of African Americans. Now, I do think that that all trauma doesn't have to be revisited just for the sake of like driving it home that, you know, African Americans went through so much, because some trauma, you know, when perpetuated, just continues to perpetuate the harm and the, you know, trauma itself, the pain itself. And so I do think it's important that when it's being talked about, that it's being talked about in the historical context of, you know, these are human rights violations that were committed, and these were the effects that it had, and in a historical context, right? And so, you know, in regard to public education, according to the United Nations Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to Remedy and Reparation, 2 forms of reparations is providing satisfaction and guarantee of non-repetition. And so part of satisfaction is a public verification of historical truth and facts, and providing the guarantee of non-repetition is to teach human rights in schools so that future generations are less likely to repeat the past. And so in the final chapter, when we talk about moving forward, one of the ideas discussed for satisfaction is for there to be educational transformation, and particularly transformation in the way that history is being taught. So, you know, a lot of that you said that you might have learned in the book, it was left out in history. Well, currently, the majority of history being taught to us in the United States is American history from the perspective of white men. And so one idea for the transformation of, you know, history, a historical education, is to be intentional about including the perspectives of everyone who was there, right? So if we're talking about the Civil War, well, let's start including all stories of the Civil War that don't just perpetuate this idea of white men being these like leaders of justice and you know, paving the way and this brave way and doing what they had to do in order to have the country that we have today. It's like, okay, well, yes, we can respect where we are today, but let's also have a realistic look at what it took to get there and what harms we're not willing to perpetuate in the future in order to continue moving forward. And then so for the guarantees of non-repeat, it's just ensuring that not only are we talking about American history in the context, I mean, with including perspectives of everyone, but we're also teaching children about human rights and when human rights have been violated in other countries in world history, and you know, just really ensuring that there's a clear understanding with all of our citizens on what human rights is, what our commitment is to protecting human rights, and what we're willing to do to protect it and what we're not willing to do to violate it, even if, you know, there is this method of providing remedy and repair.
So speaking of human rights, you touch on in the book, and you've already mentioned a couple of times tonight, our commitment as a country to upholding human rights. I think you're absolutely right that that's one of the areas that our education system is lacking, is talking about some of those areas of even what are human rights on like a global scale. Can you touch on the United States' role in some of these United Nations human rights resolutions?
Yeah, for sure. So one moment, I'm going to pull this up.
Because like Sam said, you know, our education touched on, you know, some things, you know, historically, you know, different periods of, you know, Reconstruction and Jim Crow and, you know, obviously slavery in the first place and things like that. But then you open up actually in the first little bit talking about the United Nations and some of these resolutions regarding human rights. And that's not something that I, even having been alive, you know, when most of these things were passed in the United Nations, not really knowing anything about it.
Yeah, you know, a lot of this is it's fairly new. It's, you know, been since about the 40s that you know, countries globally have begun awarding reparations for human rights violations in general. And so at the premier United Nations General Assembly, which America was a part of, right? These countries all came together in order to kind of set a standard of what are human rights? Like, what are we willing to do so that we can overall protect human rights of all people, promote social progress, and kind of like raise the standards of living for people all over the world, and just kind of like create a general sense of a better world for everyone, right? And so in that meeting, they created the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And in these human rights, articles read things like, slavery should not be permitted. No one should be subjected to torture or cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment. And that if a group of people do experience these, it is the obligation of these countries to provide remedy and reparation. And, that was kind of inserted in there just because, the nature of the way that countries do business, apparently, war is a part of that. And it's just generally recognizing that when you make the decision to go to war and to harm these groups, there needs to be remedy and repair for these groups. You can't just violate their human rights and degrade them and strip away their humanity. And that's not going to, progress us into our future potential as a humankind, as a race of humans. So, yeah. And so did that answer your question? I could go more into it, but, there are also, specific guidelines for how to provide those remedy and reparation, right? And so the United Nations reconvened to say, okay, human rights are being violated. Let's get together. Let's talk about what it's going to look like to provide this remedy and reparation for these human rights that are being violated. And essentially what that is remedy and reparation should always be provided in the form of restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and a guarantee that it's not going to happen again. So this isn't just like an apology and like, pay you, okay, sorry guys, here's a little, payment for this, but it's like, okay, let's talk about how to not do this again, right? And so in the book, we go into detail of each of those forms of reparations, and then we introduce those forms of reparations in the beginning, and then by the end, we, go through a complete detail of how that can look when applied to reparations for African Americans. Because it's a little bit different providing restoration for a group of people that you transported across an entire ocean that just can't like go back to their homeland. You know what I mean? So we discussed that further in the final chapter.
So not only did we have a hand in coming up with some of these guidelines for reparations, like we talked about earlier, we can't even get the resolution passed to open up a committee to investigate whether or not these reparations for African Americans would be beneficial. I was really shocked to learn that we've been paying reparations to other groups of people in this country for a long time. Can you touch on that real quick?
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point to make, especially in a country where we can have really firm morals on things like, the United States, we do not negotiate with terrorists, and like that's what we stand on. This isn't that, we are not like a country who do not give reparations, we do, like the United States has been known to, kind of do what you got to do in order to promote or to achieve, whatever the goal is, right? And that includes on violating the human rights of not only groups around the world, but our own citizens in the United States. And there have been several times in our past where we have made severe human rights violations against groups, and then years dozens of years, hundreds of years later, even have recognized those harms caused and were compelled to provide reparations for those groups because of the long-lasting effects that human right violation has caused on that community, right? And so that can be said for many tribes, Native American tribes. Maybe that was, one of the first human rights violations committed, along with the enslaved Africans that were brought over. But that can also be said for, Japanese Americans and the Aleuts who were put into concentration camps during World War II and just held there and treated terribly. And $20,000 were given to these groups and trusts for their communities. And an apology, right? And so in many ways, and that's not the only, and those are just some examples of times that the United States have provided reparations. And so in these examples, you can see very clearly that not only is the United States upholding their commitment to provide remedy and reparation for these human rights violations, but they are also clearly referencing the United Nations basic principles and guidelines for providing remedy and reparation to these groups, right? And so it's not like, random apologies and random money was just given. There are guidelines, there is a clear direction, like a clear path, clear steps that we can take to provide remedy and reparation. Why hasn't that happened for African Americans? Well, I think that's the obvious, right? And that's what we discussed in that's kind of the elephant in the room, and that's what we discuss in the book further. And this is just the ongoing effect. It's part of the ongoing effect of the lack of racial healing that happened immediately after slavery to kind of like repair race relations. And then in contrast, not only was there inaction taken to repair race relations, there was a racial hierarchy and a system of white supremacy that was empowered them.
Cool. And later on in the book, you do talk about some research that started around Holocaust survivors called Epigenetics. And it basically is talking about the stress of trauma leading to a change in the expression of one's genes without actually changing the DNA. And this is passed down generation to generation. And it could lead to susceptibility to other forms of trauma and distress. Can you talk a little bit about that and about how all of these traumas that the Black community has gone through, how that affects them, the community?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, there's this research around epigenetics. And so what this is saying is that the premise of this research is saying that the exposure to trauma, either experiencing it or witnessing it, right, can change your cortisol levels. And cortisol is like your stress hormone. And whenever you experience trauma, it's like affecting the way that you are responding to fight or flight. But not only is it affecting your fight or flight, it's also, affecting your blood sugar levels and the way that you metabolize and your memory formation, which is a big one when it comes to trauma, right? And so there hasn't been a lot of research within the African American community with like how exposure to extreme trauma during slavery and during Jim Crow and even now, right, is influencing our biology. But there has been comparable research in the Jewish community, specifically with Holocaust survivors and their descendants. And so what we do know is that during the Holocaust, they experienced very similar experiences, as did African Americans during Jim Crow and even during slavery, right? And whereas the Holocaust lasted for a finite period of time, this was over hundreds of years. And so what the suggestion is that, what the research should be around is, how is this stress affecting African Americans? Now, Dr. Joy DeGruy, we talk a little bit about her book, but she does research around post-traumatic slave syndrome and how like the social science around having to survive and like build these tactics to survive, and then not only having to be in this state of survival, but then having to teach that to your children so that your children can survive extreme trauma, how that in itself is traumatic, right? And then she has shown much research about how that looks in society, like how there's this sense of vacant esteem in African Americans, where there's, you can say it's self-esteem, but how can you have esteem when you're operating in a society that has systematically made you a second-class citizen, right? That where even today, the very institution that is supposed to be protecting us, right, the police, we are exposed to esteem in African Americans, where I'm getting some playback feedback. Very good. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So, and then now today, right, when we're constantly being exposed to the people that are supposed to be protecting us, killing us, right? People that look like you, you're constantly seeing live, like people that look like you being killed by the people who are protecting you, right? And then so if we go back to Dr. Ruth Thompson Miller's research on segregation stress syndrome, and her research found that people who survived the Jim Crow era experienced mirroring effects of people that experience post-traumatic stress disorder. For example, veterans and Holocaust survivors, right? Of these like extreme anxiety, sleepless nights or insomnia, and high levels of stress, etc. And so yeah, there's a lot of research that suggests that comparable effects could be happening presently in African Americans, and we could be experiencing those even more intensely because we already have been affected by this extreme stress throughout generations. And so definitely more research needs to happen, and part of that can be part of reparations, right? But yeah, that's what we are talking about in the book. That answer your question?
Yeah. Actually, the follow-up to that was how important do you think this research is on the conversation of reparations and providing mental health support and healthcare as part of reparations?
Yeah, so another form of reparations, one of the forms I mentioned in the United Nations Basic Principles of providing remedy and reparation, is rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is essentially making sure that victims of human rights violations are provided the health care and mental health care services that they need in order to kind of like overcome this trauma, to be able to get through this trauma. And I do think that this type of research is going to be really important in being able to identify exactly how this trauma is even, the effect that this trauma is even having on people, right? Because we can say that when you're not able to define exactly what you're experiencing, right? And whenever you're you're not able to label it, it just becomes this sense of frustration. And you're like, okay, I feel these things. I can't identify what it is, but I feel this frustration. I feel this sense of hopelessness. I feel this sense of vacant esteem. I feel this sense of fear, but you don't really have the science behind it to back it up. So I do think that this type of science can be really beneficial in helping us go beyond sort of the sense of just therapy, but even maybe providing a more effective forms of therapy for these victims of extreme violence and humiliation and trauma.
And kind of talking about reparations and what all that includes, you listed a thorough list of ways that the African American community has been harmed since slavery, and it's a pretty long list, including redlining and housing, education, lack of access, generational wealth, on top of the discrimination and the Jim Crow and the deaths. And this is such a long-standing problem with such an expansive reach in the African American community. Where do you think we should start?
Well, that is a good question. And this is actually descendants of the transatlantic slave trade throughout the diaspora. This is like some of the groups that have gone the longest time without there being some form of remedy and reparation, right, for the human rights violations committed against them. And so this is just continuing to compile, right? So where do we start? My best advice, or what I have to offer, is to say, look, let's start at the commitment that we made to provide remedy and reparation for victims of human rights violations, right? We have it listed out how that can look like, and how to take those steps. So let's look at this document. That's actually a really beautiful, like wonderfully well-written and really thoughtfully made document, created document. And let's start there, right? We said that we are going to provide victims with restitution, with compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, guarantee to not repeat. Okay, we said what all of that looks like, which is discussed in the book. And let's talk about how that can look for African-American descendants of slaves and African-American descendants of victims of slavery.
Sam, you're muted.
Sorry. Follow up to that. How can organizations like Stand Up for Equity, these grassroots social awareness movements, how can we help?
Yeah, well, I think even just, this is a good start, right? It's just learning as much as you can about the issue, providing education to your community. And then I think the next step from there is to, again, revisit those agreements that we made as the United States to provide remedy and reparation. And so here's the thing, right? So as you mentioned, these topics have grown so much since slavery, right? They've kind of expanded spiraled into their own monster. Well, this isn't just a issue anymore of the United States has committed a human rights violation against a group of people. What is the United States going to do about it as a country, as the government, et cetera? This is an American issue affecting all Americans of all races. Racism has interwoven itself into every single fabric in dimension of the United States, right? So where do we start? We start with making commitment, which it seems like, you guys have done, making a commitment to doing what you can in order to uproot these systems of racism and institutionalized white supremacy, identify it, make your commitment to doing it, and then make an action plan, right? And then so again, in the book and based on the United Nations Declaration, basic guidelines of providing remedy and reparation, there is examples of how you can do that. So not only can the government do that, but there are ways that communities and morally responsible individuals can adapt those forms of remedy and reparation into their everyday life and into their own local communities to provide racial healing and, economic and social justice for African Americans in their own communities.
We're talking to Chrissy Jackson, author of the Reparations Handbook. It's available May 17th, which is Monday. You talked about how we're a little divided right now as a country. Would you say that it's more important to reach allies of social justice who maybe aren't as informed about reparations issues, or are you trying to reach people who might disagree about it being necessary to provide reparations?
I'm talking to allies. I'm talking to people who are this book is intended for people who are already on their way and interested in a future of an equitable America, right? In the realm of economics, in the realm of society, just everyone in general. I think that the diversity and acknowledging the value that diversity has in every realm of society, I think that that's the future. That's inevitable. No matter if you're for reparations or not, the future is diversity. And more and more, we're really collectively seeing the value of diversity. And in order for us to have true diversity, in order for us to have a true equitable society, there has to be reparations for African Americans. And African Americans have, been here from the start. They have, literally served as the backbone of the United States, have helped build the infrastructure, has contributed in every single dimension of the United States. And have played an integral role, and then yet still are lagging behind in every part of society, right? And so even when and if racism no longer exists, which I believe is just an inevitable, right? The kids of the future are going to stop seeing race. They're going to stop, being racist, and they're going to just see everybody as everybody. But that's not going to get rid of the extreme wealth divide, right? That's not going to all of a sudden help police officers see Black people as less threatening, right? And so there needs to be an all around in every level of society in all forms of reparations. That needs to happen in order for us to reach an equitable society. So some people say, okay, well, are there other forms of reparations besides compensation payments? It's like, yes, there are, but all of it needs to happen, including compensation, including cash payments, and we talk about that further in the book as well.
So if, like you said, hopefully an equitable society is an inevitability, do you think that that's something that progressives will push towards by ourselves and everyone will catch up with us? Or do you think that that's something that we will need to come together to reach as one whole society?
Yeah, well, actually, to clarify, an equitable society is not inevitable. An equal society, a racially equal, I think that racism will inevitably stop, right? But an equitable society will not happen unless we intentionally work for it, right? Unless we intentionally identify the ways that we have been influenced by institutionalized racism, the ways that inequalities are present in society today and how it happened, right? And then do the work necessary in order to uproot those systems of racism or uproot racism from those systems in every way that we can. And I do think that it will take everyone, but I just think it will take the majority, really, because everybody's not going to be on the same page. But, if we set the precedent of when the majority, in the spirit of democracy, right? When the majority sets the precedent of the moral standards that we're going to continue to operate in, and that we are going to move the direction that we're going to move America in, then everyone else has to fall in line of that. And that just is what it is. That's the nature of democracy. And I think that I think it's more productive to spend less time on trying to get people who are not interested in reparations interested, and spend more time in focusing on really learning about why reparations are necessary, right? And really building that strong case for reparations. Because when we start to advocate for reparations with a stronger case, rather than just this like idealism of just, justice for Black people, but it's just like, no, not just justice for Black people. Like, we as America want to be an equitable society. We want to experience the benefits of having everybody, all diverse, everybody in the United States being able to contribute, because that is what's going to make us stronger as a nation. That's what's going to make us richer in every single kind of way, right? More culturally rich, maybe, or more economically rich, expand in the ways that we're able to contribute to the rest of the world, right? And the only way to do that is to make sure that we close the gaps of injustice or the inequities that have already happened. And then when we focus on that, then I think that that's when the naysayers or the people in opposition or the people who are on the fence or whatever, they can find their place in that future, I hope that was clear.
There are so many, we could talk forever about, some of the things that divide us and all of the challenges that we still face today. Is there anything that you see that gives you optimism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, in order to really have, so much is giving optimism, right? Optimism in equal society. Look what's happening now. Even Joe Biden, how he slipped this or Congress, I should say, and Joe Biden in Congress, the Joe Biden administration, how they slipped this economic stimulus package for Black farmers into the stimulus package that was recently passed, right? And that's on reparations, right? Like, that's a form of, doing little steps, doing what you can in order to move and promote a more equitable society in the United States, right the wrongs of the past, and just try to bring everybody to the same level. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot to be optimistic about. And I also think that, in the spirit of optimism, that it's most important that we focus on not what's dividing us, but what do we have in common, right? Because I think when we talk about reparations for Black people, that can be a very divisive topic for people who may not want to see separation in race, right? So how about we talk about, okay, you don't want to see separation in race, I don't want to see separation in race, right? You want to have more, you say that society is equitable, okay, I want an equitable society too. Now let's look at the data, let's look at the facts, and let's do what we can in order to close the gaps that are already existing, so that we can have this equal society,
Yeah. Excellent point. Well, Chrissy, getting into a spot where we're thinking about wrapping it up, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on that you didn't get the opportunity to?
I mean, I just want to say, I think another thing that's optimist is we're having a conversation right now, right? So
right.
Thank you guys for your time and interest in reparations and a more equitable America, and taking action to making sure that it happens. So I don't have anything else. If you guys have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer. Otherwise, Reparations Handbook is available May 17th. May 17th is also the anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court decision that legally ended segregation in the United States. So that's something to celebrate.
Did you plan that on purpose?
I did. I thought it was
Fantastic.
an appropriate day if we're at a release.
Very appropriate. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Everybody go out and get this book. It is a fantastic read. It is full of things that you do not know. I promise you, you will learn so much from this. Even if you, like us, you seek out information, you already think that you know a lot. So this has something for everyone.
And Christy said at the beginning that she hoped this would be a resource for allies to go back on. And I fully believe that this is a great resource that we can use to build an argument for reparations. And if you don't get this book, you will be missing out.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Right. Have a good night.
You too.